A child's scream pierced through a blizzard so violent it buried entire cabins, and the mountain man who found her half frozen in the snow had no idea that saving her life would uncover a secret that had been hidden for 50 years. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind didn't just howl that night. It screamed. It tore through the Montana mountains like something alive, something angry, ripping branches from pines that had stood for 100 years and hurling snow sideways with such force it felt like the sky itself was trying to bury the world. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, and that was before the wind chill turned the air into something that could kill you in minutes. Up here, 14 miles from the nearest town and another 6 from the closest neighbor, winter wasn't just a season. It was a test, and most people failed. But Thomas Garrett wasn't most people. He was 57 years old, built like a man who'd spent decades chopping wood and hauling water, with a beard gone silver and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He'd lived alone in his cabin on the northern face of Copper Ridge for 11 years now, ever since the day he'd packed everything he owned into his truck and driven until the road ran out. He didn't talk to people anymore. Didn't want to. The world had taken enough from him, and he'd decided the only way to survive was to stop giving it opportunities to take more. His cabin was small but solid. He'd built most of it himself using timber from the surrounding forest, and every nail, every beam, every shingle was placed with the kind of precision that came from a man who understood that mistakes up here could kill you. The walls were thick, insulated with layers of newspaper and old wool blankets. The roof was steep to shed snow, and the windows were small to keep the heat in. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and tonight it roared with a fire so hot the iron grate glowed orange. Thomas sat in his chair near the flames, a cup of black coffee cooling in his calloused hands, listening to the storm rage outside like a living thing trying to get in. He'd been through worse. The winter of 2009 had dropped 9 feet of snow in 3 days and knocked out power across the entire region for 2 weeks. He'd survived that without even noticing the power was gone because he'd never had it to begin with. He heated with wood, cooked on a cast iron stove, and read by kerosene lamp. The only concession he'd made to modernity was a small solar panel he'd rigged to charge a ham radio and a couple of batteries for his flashlight. Everything else was 19th century simple, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The clock on the mantel, an old wind-up his grandfather had given him, ticked softly. It was just past 8 in the evening, though up here in the winter dark came early and stayed late. Thomas drained the last of his coffee and stood, joints popping as he stretched. He needed to check the woodpile, make sure the tarp was still secured. A storm like this could rip it loose, and wet wood in January was a death sentence. He pulled on his heavy coat, a battered canvas thing lined with sheep's wool, and wrapped a thick scarf around his face. His boots were old but waterproof, the kind with enough tread to grip ice. He grabbed his flashlight and pushed open the door. The wind hit him like a fist, stealing his breath and forcing him back a step. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, and the cold bit through every layer he wore. He lowered his head and pushed forward, using the rope he'd strung between the cabin and the shed as a guide. Visibility was maybe 3 feet. Any farther and the world disappeared into white static. The woodpile was fine. The tarp had come loose on one corner, but he secured it with fresh rope and made sure everything was tied down tight. He was about to head back when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a sound that made every muscle in his body go rigid. A scream, high-pitched, desperate, and undeniably human. Thomas froze, his breath forming clouds that were instantly torn away by the wind. He turned his head, trying to locate the source, but the storm distorted everything. Sound bounced off the trees, echoed through the ravines, and twisted back on itself. For a moment, he thought maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind screaming through a crack in the rocks, or a branch snapping under the weight of ice. Then he heard it again, closer this time. A child's voice, raw with terror and cold. Every instinct told him to go back inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. Children didn't just appear on mountains in the middle of blizzards. This was wrong. This was dangerous. But even as his mind catalogued all the reasons to walk away, his body was already moving. He grabbed the rope and followed it away from the shed, angling toward where he thought the sound had come from. He called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Hey, where are you?" Nothing. Just wind and snow and the creaking of trees bent nearly double. He took another step, then another, his flashlight beam cutting weak and useless through the whiteout. He was about to turn back when his boot caught something soft. He looked down and his heart stopped. A child. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, curled in the snow wearing nothing but jeans, a thin jacket and sneakers. Her lips were blue, her skin was grey. Ice had formed in her hair and on her eyelashes. She wasn't moving. Thomas dropped to his knees, his hands already moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen hypothermia before. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint and slow, but there. She was alive, barely. He didn't waste time asking questions. He scooped her up, shocked by how light she was, and ran for the cabin. The storm fought him every step, and twice he nearly lost his footing on the ice, but he kept moving. He kicked open the cabin door and carried her straight to the fireplace, laying her down on the thick rug in front of the flames. Her body was rigid, locked in the fetal position, and when he tried to straighten her arms, they barely moved. He worked fast. First, he stripped off her wet clothes, his movements clinical and detached. Hypothermia didn't care about modesty. Wet clothing would kill her faster than the cold itself. He grabbed every blanket he owned and wrapped her in layers, then pulled her closer to the fire. Not too close. Rapid rewarming could stop her heart, but close enough that the heat would start working. Her pulse was still weak, her breathing shallow. Thomas filled a pot with water and set it on the stove to heat, then grabbed a bottle of honey from the shelf. Sugar. She'd need sugar if she woke up, if her body could still process it. He knelt beside her and rubbed her arms and legs through the blankets, trying to stimulate circulation without being too rough. Frostbite was a real possibility, especially in her fingers and toes. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The girl didn't move. Thomas kept working, kept checking her pulse, kept talking to her even though he didn't know if she could hear him. "Come on, kid, stay with me. You're safe now. You're warm. Just breathe." At the 20-minute mark, her eyelids fluttered. A good sign. Thomas leaned closer, watching her face. Her lips were starting to lose some of that awful blue tint, fading to a pale pink. Her fingers twitched. Then, all at once, her eyes snapped open, and she gasped, a huge, shuddering breath that sounded like she was drowning. She tried to sit up, to scramble away, but the blankets tangled around her, and she collapsed back down. "Easy," Thomas said, his voice low and steady. "Easy. You're okay. You're inside. You're safe." The girl stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, brown eyes dark as river stones, set in a small face framed by wet, tangled black hair. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her whole body was shaking now, violent tremors that rattled her teeth together. Thomas grabbed the pot of warm water and poured some into a mug, adding a generous spoonful of honey. He knelt beside her and held it out. "Drink this. Slow sips. It'll help." She didn't move, just stared at him like he was something dangerous. Thomas set the mug down within her reach and backed up a few feet, giving her space. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "My name's Thomas. You were outside in the storm. I brought you in. You were freezing." The girl's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the rough wooden walls, the shelves lined with canned goods and tools, the single window covered with frost so thick it looked like frosted glass. She looked at the door, clearly calculating if she could run. Thomas saw the thought cross her face and shook his head. "Storm's still going," he said. "You go back out there, you'll die. That's not a threat. That's just the truth." Her trembling intensified. She wrapped the blankets tighter around herself and pulled her knees to her chest, never taking her eyes off him. Thomas stayed where he was, hands visible, posture non-threatening. He'd been around enough scared animals to know you didn't crowd them. You gave them time and space and let them come to you. After a long silence, the girl's eyes drifted to the mug. She stared at it like it might bite her, then slowly reached out and wrapped both hands around it. The warmth seemed to surprise her. She lifted it to her lips and took a tiny sip, then another. Thomas watched her throat work as she swallowed. Good. That was good. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. Just drank more of the honey water, her hands shaking so badly some of it sloshed over the rim. "Where are your parents?" "Nothing." She wouldn't even look at him now. Thomas rubbed his face, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. He had about 1,000 questions and 0 answers. How had a child ended up on his mountain in the middle of a blizzard? Where had she come from? The nearest town was 14 miles away, and the road had been impassable for 2 days. Even if someone had driven up before the storm hit, no parent in their right mind would let a kid wander off dressed like that, which meant something was very, very wrong. He stood slowly and moved to the window, peeling back the edge of the frost to peer outside. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had gotten worse. Snow was piling up against the cabin in drifts that were already 3 feet high. Even if he wanted to get her down the mountain, it was impossible. The roads would be buried. The truck wouldn't make it 10 feet. They were stuck here until the weather broke, and that could be days. He turned back to find the girl watching him, the empty mug clutched in her lap. She looked so small, wrapped in all those blankets, like a bird that had fallen from its nest. Her wet hair was starting to dry in messy tangles around her face, and now that some color had returned to her cheeks, he could see she had a small scar on her chin, maybe from a fall or an accident. "You can sleep by the fire," Thomas said, gesturing to the rug. "I'll keep it going all night. You'll be warm. Safe." The girl's eyes tracked him as he moved to the small cot in the corner of the cabin where he usually slept. He grabbed a pillow and tossed it near the fire, then added another log to the flames. Sparks spiraled up the chimney and the fire crackled, filling the room with flickering orange light. "I'm going to make something to eat," Thomas said. "You hungry?" For the first time, the girl's expression shifted, just slightly but enough. Her eyes flicked to the stove, then back to him. She gave the smallest nod. Thomas almost smiled. Almost. He rummaged through his supplies and pulled out a can of soup, chicken noodle, the kind with chunks of real meat and thick broth. He dumped it into a pot and set it on the stove to heat, then cut thick slices from a loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days ago. The smell filled the cabin, warm and rich, and he saw the girl's nostrils flare as she breathed it in. When the soup was ready, he poured it into a bowl and brought it over, setting it down next to her along with a spoon and a piece of bread. Then he retreated to the table and fixed a bowl for himself, making a point of eating first so she'd see it was safe. He took a big bite of bread, chewed, swallowed. The girl watched every movement. Finally, she picked up the spoon. Her hands were still shaking, and the first spoonful spilled before it reached her mouth, but the second one made it. She ate slowly at first, then faster, like she hadn't eaten in days. Thomas let her finish the whole bowl before he spoke again. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, "and I know you don't know me. But you're safe here, I promise. Nobody's going to hurt you." The girl set down the empty bowl and pulled the blankets tighter. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Thomas thought she was going to break down completely, but she just wiped her face with the edge of the blanket and stared at the fire. Thomas stood and walked to the small shelf where he kept a few books, a deck of cards, and a wooden box filled with odds and ends. He pulled out a pencil and a notepad, then set them down near the girl. "If you don't want to talk, you can write," he said, "or draw, whatever helps." She looked at the pencil for a long time. Then, with movements so slow and deliberate they seemed painful, she picked it up. She didn't write words. Instead, she drew. A simple shape, crude but clear. A door, just a door, standing alone on the page. She stared at it, her brow furrowed, then drew it again. and again. 3 identical doors side by side. Thomas frowned. What does that mean? The girl's hand tightened on the pencil. She drew a 4th door, pressing so hard the lead snapped. She flinched and dropped the pencil like it had burned her, then curled back into her blankets and wouldn't look at him. Thomas picked up the notepad and studied the drawings. 4 doors. No context, no explanation. Just doors. He set it aside and added another log to the fire, his mind racing. This wasn't random. Kids didn't just appear on mountains in blizzards. Kids didn't refuse to speak or draw the same image over and over unless something had happened to them, something bad. He thought about calling the sheriff, but the ham radio only worked for long-distance communication, and even then, only when the weather cooperated. He could try in the morning, assuming the storm let up, but part of him hesitated. If this girl was running from something, calling the authorities might be exactly the wrong move. She was terrified. Not of him, he didn't think, but of something. Someone. He looked at her again, curled up by the fire like a wounded animal. She'd stopped shaking at least, and her breathing had evened out. Her eyes were starting to close, exhaustion finally winning over fear. Get some sleep, Thomas said softly. We'll figure this out in the morning. The girl didn't respond. Within minutes, her breathing deepened and her body went slack. She was out. Thomas watched her for a long time, this small, fragile thing that had somehow survived a blizzard that should have killed her. He'd spent 11 years avoiding human contact, avoiding connection, avoiding the risk of caring about anything that could be taken away. And now, in the space of an hour, all of that had been shattered by a child who wouldn't even tell him her name. He moved to the window and looked out at the storm. The wind was still howling, still burying the world in white. Somewhere out there, someone was missing this girl. Someone was looking for her. Or should be. And Thomas had a sinking feeling that when they found her, things were going to get a whole lot more complicated. He turned back to the cabin, to the fire, to the sleeping child wrapped in blankets on his floor. He didn't know her story yet, didn't know where she'd come from or what she was running from, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her, not on his mountain, not while she was under his roof. He settled into the chair near the fire, close enough to keep watch, and let his eyes drift half-closed. Sleep would come in fits tonight. He'd learned long ago how to rest without ever fully letting his guard down. Outside, the storm screamed and battered the walls. Inside, the fire crackled and the girl breathed softly, safe for now in the shelter of a stranger's kindness. Thomas didn't believe in fate, didn't believe things happened for a reason. But sitting there in the firelight, watching over a child who'd appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the worst storm in years, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the life he'd built here, the careful isolation, the deliberate distance from the world had just been irrevocably changed. And somewhere deep in his gut, beneath the questions and the worry and the bone-deep exhaustion, he felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Purpose. The night stretched on. The storm raged. And in a cabin lost to the world on the side of a frozen mountain, a man who'd forgotten how to care began to remember. The storm broke on the 3rd day. Thomas woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural after 72 hours of wind that had sounded like freight trains colliding. He sat up in his chair, neck stiff from another night of half-sleep, and looked first to the fire, still burning, down to coals, and then to the girl. She was awake, sitting upright in her nest of blankets, staring at the frost-covered window with an expression he couldn't read. "Morning," Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. The girl turned to look at him, but didn't respond. 3 days together, and she still hadn't spoken a word. She ate when he put food in front of her. She drank when he handed her water. She used the small bathroom he'd pointed out without needing to be told. But she didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't do anything that resembled normal childhood behavior. She just existed, quiet and watchful, like a ghost haunting his cabin. Thomas stood and stretched, feeling every one of his 57 years in his lower back and knees. He moved to the window and scraped away some of the frost with his thumbnail. Outside, the world had been transformed. Snow covered everything in smooth, perfect drifts that came up past the windowsill. The trees were so heavy with it their branches drooped nearly to the ground. The sky was pale blue and cloudless, beautiful and merciless. It would take him hours to dig out, and even then the road down the mountain would be impassable for at least another day. He turned back to find the girl standing now, the blankets wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak. She was looking at him with those dark, serious eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "I need to dig us out," Thomas said. "Clear the door, check the shed, make sure nothing collapsed under the weight. You'll stay inside where it's warm. Understand?" The girl nodded once. "Good." Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and boots, wound the scarf around his face, and grabbed the snow shovel from beside the door. "Keep the fire going. I'll be back in an hour." He pushed open the door and had to shove hard against the drift that had piled against it. Snow cascaded into the cabin, and the girl scrambled back to avoid it. Thomas squeezed through the gap and pulled the door shut behind him, then stopped to take in the full scope of what the storm had left behind. The drifts were massive, some of them 6 or 7 feet tall where the wind had sculpted them against the cabin and shed. His truck was completely buried, just a vague lump under the white. The rope he'd strung as a guideline was still there, frozen solid and crusted with ice. He couldn't see the road at all, couldn't even see where the road was supposed to be. Everything was just white, broken only by the dark verticals of tree trunks. Thomas set to work. He dug methodically, clearing a path from the door to the woodpile first, then to the shed, then working his way around the perimeter of the cabin to make sure the vents weren't blocked. The physical labor felt good, centering. It gave him something to focus on besides the impossible situation inside his cabin. By the time he'd cleared enough space to function, the sun was directly overhead, and sweat was freezing on his face beneath the scarf. He checked the shed carefully. The door was frozen shut, but he got it open with some effort. Inside, everything looked intact. The tools hung neatly on their hooks. The spare wood was dry and stacked. The old tarp he used to cover the riding mower in summer was folded in the corner. He was about to leave when something caught his eye. The back wall looked wrong. Thomas frowned and moved closer. The shed was small, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, and he'd built it himself 6 years ago. He knew every board, every nail. But looking at the back wall now, he noticed something he'd never seen before. The boards didn't quite line up. There was a vertical seam, subtle but definitely there, running from floor to ceiling about 3 feet from the right corner. He pressed his palm against the wood. It felt solid enough, but when he knocked on it with his knuckles, the sound that came back was hollow. Wrong. He knocked again, moving along the seam, and got the same hollow echo. His frown deepened. Thomas grabbed a crowbar from the tool rack and wedged it into the seam. He applied pressure, slowly, feeling for give. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something clicked deep in the wall, and the entire section swung inward like a door, smooth and silent on hidden hinges. Cold air rushed out, colder even than the shed. Thomas stepped back, his breath forming clouds. Behind the false wall was darkness, complete and absolute darkness. He grabbed his flashlight from his coat pocket and clicked it on, sweeping the beam into the opening. A passage, narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, leading down into the earth at a steep angle. The walls were concrete, old but solid, and the floor was dirt that had been packed smooth by years of settling. Wooden support beams crossed the ceiling every few feet, and from one of them hung an old kerosene lantern, unlit. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He'd owned this property for 11 years, had built this shed with his own hands, had stored tools and supplies in it probably 500 times. And he'd never known this was here, never even suspected. He aimed the flashlight down the passage, but the beam didn't reach far enough to see where it ended. Just darkness and more concrete, and the sense of something waiting, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. Every instinct told him to close the door and walk away, to pretend he'd never seen it. But Thomas had never been good at walking away from things, no matter how much he'd tried. He stepped into the passage. The air was stale and dry, untouched by the storm outside. His boots scuffed against the packed earth, too loud in the enclosed space. He moved slowly, one hand trailing along the concrete wall, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The passage descended at a steady angle, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30. He counted his steps, 42, 43, 44. At step 53, the passage ended. Thomas stopped and raised the flashlight. In front of him was a door. Not wooden like the false wall in the shed, but metal. Heavy gauge steel with rivets along the edges and a wheel-style lock in the center, like something from a bank vault. There was no rust on it, no corrosion. Someone had maintained this, recently. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the wheel. It turned easily, well-oiled, clicking as the internal mechanisms disengaged. When the final click sounded, Thomas pulled the door open. The space beyond was a room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with concrete walls and a low ceiling supported by thick beams. And it was full. Filing cabinets lined one wall, 4 of them tall and industrial grey. A wooden desk sat in the center of the room with a chair pushed under it. Shelves covered another wall, holding boxes and binders and what looked like radio equipment. And on the far wall, someone had pinned dozens of photographs, maps and documents, all connected by lines of red string like something from a detective movie. Thomas stepped inside, his flashlight beams sweeping across everything. The air here was even colder, and his breath came out in thick white clouds. He moved to the desk first. The surface was clean except for a single folder, closed, with a label typed across the front. Project Sanctuary, 1983 to 1997. He opened it. Inside were documents. Official-looking documents with government seals and classification stamps. The first page was a memo dated March 14, 1983, addressed to someone named Director Calloway. Thomas scanned the text, his frown deepening with each line. Continuation of relocated family units under Federal Witness Protection Protocol 7B. 14 active households currently maintained in designated safe zones across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Concerns regarding security breaches at the Billings location. Thomas flipped to the next page. It was a list of names, maybe 30 of them, organized by family units. Beside each name was a location code and a date. Some of the dates went back to the 1970s. Others were more recent, the latest from 1997. And next to more than half the names, someone had written a single word in red ink: compromised. His stomach turned cold. He set the folder down and moved to the wall of photographs. Up close, he could see they were surveillance photos, the kind taken with telephoto lenses from a distance. Families getting into cars, children playing in yards, adults walking into buildings. Each photo had a name and date written in the margin, and on many of them, red X's had been drawn across the faces. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen enough. This wasn't just some forgotten storage room. This was evidence of something that had gone very, very wrong. A witness protection program that had been compromised. Families that had been relocated to keep them safe, only to be found anyway. And judging by those red X's, found by people who didn't have their best interests at heart. He turned to the filing cabinets and pulled open the first drawer. It was full of folders, each one labeled with a family name and case number. He grabbed one at random and flipped it open. Inside were detailed records, original identities, new identities, relocation addresses, handler contact information, incident reports. Everything you'd need to track someone who was supposed to have disappeared. The second drawer held more of the same. The third was full of photographs and physical evidence, jewelry, documents, things that must have been taken from the families. The fourth drawer stuck when he tried to open it. Thomas pulled harder, and it finally slid free with a screech of metal on metal. This drawer was different. Instead of files, it held cassette tapes, dozens of them, each one labeled with a date and time. Thomas grabbed the one on top. December 9th, 1996, 0200 hours. He looked around the room and spotted an old tape recorder on one of the shelves. He carried it to the desk, plugged in the tape, and pressed play. Static crackled through the small speaker, then voices. Two men talking in low tones. "Can't keep doing this. They're getting closer." "We don't have a choice. The program's been compromised from the inside. Someone's been selling locations." "How many families are left?" "4. Maybe 5 if the Hendersons got out in time." "Jesus Christ, what about the safe houses?" "Locked down, evidence secured. If anyone finds them, they'll know everything." A long pause, then. "And the kids?" "Relocated, new identities. It's the best we can do." The tape hissed and went silent. Thomas stared at the recorder, his mind racing. He ejected the tape and grabbed another. This one was dated June 3rd, 1997. He played it. More voices, different people. A woman this time, sounding desperate. "They found us. I don't know how, but they found us. We have to move again." A man's voice, calm but tense. "There's nowhere left to move you to. The program's been shut down. You're on your own." "What are we supposed to do? They have our real names. They know about Sarah." "I'm sorry, I truly am. But my hands are tied. Destroy everything and run. It's the only chance you have." Sobbing, then the line went dead. Thomas turned off the recorder and sat down hard in the chair. His hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was understanding. This bunker, hidden beneath his property, had been a command center for a witness protection program that had fallen apart. Families had been relocated to keep them safe, but someone had compromised the system, sold their locations, and those families had been hunted down one by one. He thought of the girl upstairs in his cabin, the girl who wouldn't speak, who drew doors over and over, who'd appeared in the middle of a blizzard wearing clothes that wouldn't keep a person alive for 10 minutes in that weather. She was running from something connected to all of this. Thomas stood and moved back to the wall of photographs. He studied them more carefully now, looking for anything familiar. Most of the faces meant nothing to him. But then his eyes landed on one photo in the bottom right corner, and his blood ran cold. It was a family, 2 adults and a young girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing in front of a house. The photo was dated August 19, 2012. Recent, very recent. And the girl in the photo had dark hair and dark eyes and a small scar on her chin. It was her. The girl upstairs. She was younger in the photo, but it was definitely her. Thomas pulled the photo off the wall and flipped it over. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting he'd seen on the files, were 3 names: Michael and Patricia Delaney. Daughter Emma. Relocated Billings to Whitefish. Case number 379B. Status: active. Emma. Her name was Emma. What the mountain man found behind that hidden door would explain why men in black SUVs were now climbing the mountain in the middle of a blizzard, why the girl's eyes filled with terror every time she heard an engine, and why sometimes the most innocent lives carry the most dangerous secrets. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Thomas grabbed the file marked 379B from the cabinet and carried it to the desk. His hands moved quickly now, flipping through pages, absorbing information. Michael Delaney had been a forensic accountant who'd testified against a money laundering operation tied to organized crime. The operation had connections that went deep, all the way into federal agencies. After his testimony, the Delaney family had been placed into witness protection in 1998. They'd been moved 6 times in 14 years. 6 times because they kept being found. The most recent incident report was dated January 4th of this year, just 6 days ago. The report was brief, clinical in its language, but Thomas could read between the lines. Safe house breach confirmed. Primary subjects Michael and Patricia Delaney confirmed deceased. Minor subject Emma Delaney missing, presumed fled. Recommend immediate retrieval and relocation. Case priority. Critical. Thomas set the paper down, his jaw tight. Emma's parents were dead, killed 6 days ago, and she'd run. Somehow a 7-year-old girl had escaped whatever had happened to her family and made it here, to the one place that might hold answers. To the one place connected to the program that was supposed to keep her safe but had failed so catastrophically. He looked around the bunker with new eyes. This wasn't just evidence. This was ammunition. Every file, every tape, every photograph documented a massive failure, a conspiracy, a system that had been corrupted from within. People had died because someone had sold them out, and Emma was the only witness left. Thomas gathered up the file, the photo, and 2 of the cassette tapes. He needed to get back upstairs, needed to check on Emma, needed to figure out what the hell to do next. He was halfway to the door when he noticed something else. A lockbox, small and fireproof, sitting on the bottom shelf behind some binders. He pulled it out and tried the latch. Locked. He looked around for a key and found one taped to the underside of the desk. The lock clicked open easily, and Thomas lifted the lid. Inside was a handgun, a Glock 9mm, and 3 full magazines. Beside the gun was a cell phone, old but charged, and a folded piece of paper. Thomas unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten note, the ink faded but still legible. If you're reading this, then something's gone wrong. The program was supposed to protect people, but it's been compromised. I've documented everything I could, but I don't know who to trust anymore. The families in these files deserve justice. They deserve the truth. If you find this, please don't let it be for nothing. Contact Agent Sarah Chen at the FBI field office in Helena. She's clean. She's one of the few who is. Case number for reference, Sanctuary 7B. She'll know what it means. It was signed with initials, RM. Thomas folded the note and put it in his pocket along with the cell phone. He took the gun too, checking the magazine and chamber out of habit. 15 rounds. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to be armed, but standing in a bunker full of evidence that people had been murdered for, it seemed like a smart precaution. He gathered everything and made his way back up the passage, his mind working through possibilities and problems. The storm had bought them time, but not much. If Emma's case was marked priority critical, someone would be looking for her. And if that someone was connected to whoever had compromised the program in the first place, they wouldn't stop until they found her. Thomas emerged from the shed and pulled the false wall closed behind him, making sure it was secure. The sun was starting to dip toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. Beautiful and completely indifferent to the darkness Thomas had just uncovered. He crossed the cleared path to the cabin and pushed open the door. Emma was exactly where he'd left her, sitting by the fire wrapped in blankets. But when she saw him, her eyes went wide. She stared at the file in his hands, and all the color drained from her face. "Emma," Thomas said quietly, closing the door behind him. "That's your name, right? Emma Delaney?" The girl's whole body went rigid. For a moment, Thomas thought she might bolt, might try to run even though there was nowhere to go. But then something in her expression crumbled, and she nodded. Just once. So small he almost missed it. Thomas set the file on the table and pulled out the photograph, the one of Emma with her parents. He knelt down so he was at her level and held it out to her. Emma's hands came up slowly, trembling, and took the photo. She stared at it, and tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and steady. "I found a room," Thomas said gently, "under the shed. It's full of files about families like yours, families that were supposed to be protected. I know what happened to you, Emma. I know about your parents. I'm so sorry." Emma's face twisted, and a sound escaped her that was barely human. A keening wail of grief so raw it made Thomas's chest ache. She clutched the photo to her chest and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of it. Thomas didn't try to comfort her, didn't reach out. He just stayed there, kneeling on the floor, giving her space to break apart. When the worst of it had passed, Emma wiped her face with the blanket and looked at him. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse and broken. "They killed them," she whispered. "The men came at night. Mama told me to hide. There's a place under the kitchen floor, a hiding spot. She put me in there and told me to be quiet no matter what I heard." Thomas's jaw clenched. "How long were you in there?" "I don't know. Hours. I heard—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I heard everything. And then it got quiet. I waited until morning, and then I climbed out. They were gone. Mama and Dad were gone. There was so much blood. How did you get here, Emma? She looked down at the photo in her hands. Dad used to talk about the safe houses. He had maps hidden in his office. I found one. It showed this place. He said if anything ever happened, if we got separated, I should come here. He said there were answers here. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. Michael Delaney had known about the bunker, had known about the evidence, and he'd tried to give his daughter a chance, even if it meant sending her into the wilderness alone. How long did it take you to get here? 3 days. I walked. I hid when I saw cars. On the last day, the storm started. I got lost. I couldn't see anything. I thought I was going to die. You almost did, Thomas said quietly. You're lucky you made it this far. Emma looked at him with those 2 old eyes. Are you going to help me? Thomas didn't hesitate. Yes. They're going to come looking for me. The men who killed my parents. They know I'm alive. They'll know I ran. I know. And they'll kill you too if they find you helping me. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Let them try. For the first time since he'd found her in the snow, Emma's expression softened. Not a smile, but something close. Something that looked like hope. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains bathed in twilight. The roads would be clear enough to travel by tomorrow, maybe the day after, which meant he had maybe 48 hours to figure out what to do. He could try to contact this Agent Chen, assuming the number in the file was still good and assuming she was actually trustworthy. Or he could take Emma and run, disappear into the mountains and hope they could stay hidden long enough to matter. Neither option felt safe, but doing nothing wasn't an option at all. He turned back to Emma. The note in the bunker mentioned someone at the FBI, said she was clean. We could try to reach her. Emma shook her head violently. No police, no FBI. That's how they found us last time. Someone on the inside told them where we were. Then what do you want to do? Emma looked at the file on the table, at all those names marked compromised. I want them to pay, the people who did this. I want everyone to know what they did. Thomas studied her. 7 years old, and talking about justice like a grown woman who'd seen the worst of the world. Maybe she had. The files in that bunker, Thomas said slowly. They're evidence. Every family that was betrayed, every person who died, it's all documented down there. If we could get it to the right people, people outside the system, it could bring down everyone involved. You mean like reporters? Maybe, or lawyers, someone who can't be bought or threatened into silence. Emma considered this. How? I don't know yet, Thomas admitted. But we've got time to figure it out. First thing we need to do is make sure you're safe, and that means being ready in case someone comes looking. He walked to the closet and pulled out the hunting rifle he kept for protection against bears and mountain lions. He checked it, loaded it, and set it near the door. Then he pulled out the Glock from his coat and set it on the table. Emma stared at the guns with wide eyes. Have you ever fired a weapon? Thomas asked. She shook her head. Then you're going to learn. Not tonight, but soon. Up here, you need to know how to protect yourself. Emma nodded slowly. She looked scared, but there was steel underneath it. She'd survived things that would have broken most adults. She was stronger than she looked. Thomas moved to the kitchen and started preparing dinner, something warm and filling. As he worked, he thought about everything he'd learned in the bunker. The program had been running for decades. Hundreds of families, maybe thousands, relocated and given new lives. And someone had systematically hunted them down. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make it clear this wasn't random. This was organized, professional. And Emma was the last loose end. He served the food, and they ate in silence. The only sound the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind outside. When they finished, Emma helped him clean up, moving around the cabin with the careful precision of a child who'd learned to be useful, to not be a burden. You should get some sleep, Thomas said. Tomorrow we'll start making plans. Emma climbed back into her nest of blankets by the fire, but she didn't lie down. She sat up, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Yeah? Thank you for not sending me away." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "You don't have to thank me, kid. This is what people are supposed to do. Help each other. Most people don't." She wasn't wrong. Thomas had spent 11 years isolating himself because he'd learned exactly that lesson. Most people didn't help. Most people looked the other way, protected themselves, chose safety over decency. He'd done it himself after he'd lost everything that mattered. He'd walked away from the world and told himself it was better that way. But looking at Emma now, this small, fierce, broken child who'd survived impossible odds, he realized something. Maybe isolation wasn't safety. Maybe it was just another kind of death. "Get some sleep," he said again, softer this time. "I'll keep watch." Emma finally lay down, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Within minutes, her breathing evened out, and she was asleep. Thomas settled into his chair and stared at the file on the table, at the photograph of Emma's parents, at the evidence of a conspiracy that had destroyed lives for decades. He'd come to these mountains to hide from the world, to escape from pain and loss and the burden of caring about anything. But the world had found him anyway, delivered to his doorstep in the form of a freezing child with secrets buried in her bones. And Thomas Garrett, who'd spent 11 years running from purpose, suddenly found himself with the clearest sense of direction he'd had in over a decade. He was going to protect this child. He was going to expose the truth. And he was going to make damn sure that the people responsible for destroying her family faced justice, even if it killed him. Outside, the night settled over the mountain like a blanket. Stars appeared in the clear sky, bright and cold and infinite. And somewhere out there, in offices and safe houses and dark rooms where terrible decisions were made, people were looking for a little girl who knew too much. But they'd have to go through Thomas Garrett to get to her. And he had no intention of making it easy. Thomas woke to the sound of an engine. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The low rumble of a vehicle grinding through snow somewhere down the mountain. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of grey and pale pink. He couldn't see the road from here, but he could hear the engine getting closer. Not one vehicle, two, maybe three. Emma sat up, blankets falling away, her eyes wide with fear. "Is it them?" "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "But we're not taking chances. Get dressed. Warm clothes, boots, everything." She scrambled to obey, pulling on the spare clothes Thomas had given her. Clothes that were far too big, but at least were dry and warm. Thomas moved quickly through the cabin, grabbing supplies. The backpack from the closet, matches, a knife, water bottles, energy bars, the first aid kit. He stuffed everything in with practiced efficiency while keeping one ear trained on the sound of those engines. They were closer now, maybe a mile away, maybe less. The sound echoed off the rocks and trees, making it hard to judge distance. Thomas slung the backpack over one shoulder and grabbed the Glock from the table, checking the magazine one more time before tucking it into his belt. The rifle he kept in his hands. "Emma," he said, his voice steady and firm. "Listen to me very carefully. We're going out the back and heading into the woods. There's a trail that leads up to the ridge, hard to follow unless you know it's there. We're going to take that trail and put some distance between us and whoever's coming. Do exactly what I say when I say it. Understand?" She nodded, her face pale but composed. No tears, no panic, just focus. Thomas felt a surge of respect for this kid. He led her to the back door, eased it open, and peered out. The woods behind the cabin were thick with pine and aspen, the snow untouched except for animal tracks. No sign of movement. He stepped out, Emma right behind him, and they moved quickly into the tree line. The moment they were under cover, Thomas stopped and turned back to look at the cabin. From here, he had a clear view of the front, and what he saw made his blood run cold. 3 black SUVs were grinding up the access road, their tires chewing through the snow. They moved in formation, military style, and when they stopped in front of the cabin, 8 men climbed out. They wore dark tactical gear, vests and boots and weapons slung across their chests. Not local cops, not park rangers. These were professionals. Thomas pulled Emma down behind a fallen log and put a finger to his lips. She nodded, her breathing shallow and quick. They watched as the men spread out, 4 moving toward the front door, 2 circling around the sides, 2 staying back near the vehicles. The way they moved, the way they communicated with hand signals, it was all wrong. These weren't people coming to help. These were hunters. One of the men stepped up to the front door and pounded on it with his fist. "Federal agents, open up!" Thomas's jaw clenched. Federal agents didn't show up unannounced in the middle of nowhere wearing full tactical gear. And they definitely didn't travel in groups of 8 for a welfare check on a missing child. When no one answered, the man at the door didn't hesitate. He nodded to one of his companions, who pulled out a small breaching tool and fitted it to the lock. One sharp crack, and the door swung open. The 4 men at the front entered quickly, weapons raised, clearing the cabin with professional efficiency. Thomas counted to 30 in his head. The men emerged, one of them shaking his head. They'd found the cabin empty. Good. Now they'd search the property, check the shed, maybe try to track where Emma and Thomas had gone. That would buy time, but not much. He tapped Emma's shoulder and jerked his head toward the trail. They needed to move, now. They climbed in silence, Thomas leading the way and Emma following close behind. The trail was steep and treacherous, hidden under 2 feet of fresh snow. Thomas had hiked it dozens of times over the years, knew every switchback and ledge, but in these conditions it was dangerous. One wrong step and they'd tumble down the mountainside. Behind them, he could hear shouting, commands being barked. The men had found something, probably the tracks leading into the woods. "Faster," Thomas whispered, and Emma picked up her pace. They climbed for 20 minutes, maybe 30. Thomas's lungs burned and his legs screamed, but he didn't slow down. Emma was struggling, her breath coming in gasps, but she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop. She just kept moving, 1 foot in front of the other, this 7-year-old girl climbing a mountain in winter because men with guns were hunting her. The trail leveled out as they reached the ridge. Thomas stopped in a small clearing surrounded by boulders and turned to look back down the mountain. From here, he could see the cabin far below, tiny as a dollhouse. He could see the black SUVs parked outside, and he could see movement in the woods, dark figures spreading out, searching. "Are they following us?" Emma asked between gasps. "Not yet," Thomas said, "but they will be. They'll find our tracks eventually." "What do we do?" Thomas looked around, assessing their options. The ridge stretched east and west, following the spine of the mountain. To the east, it led deeper into the wilderness, miles of forest and rock with no roads, no structures, nothing but nature. To the west, it descended toward the old fire lookout tower, abandoned for years but still standing. The tower was maybe 3 miles away, a hard 3 miles in this snow, but it would give them high ground and a defensible position. "We head for the tower," Thomas decided. "It's shelter, and I know the terrain. We can see them coming from there." They moved west along the ridge, staying below the skyline to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The wind up here was brutal, cutting through their clothes like knives. Emma's face was red from the cold, and ice was forming on her eyelashes, but she kept moving. Thomas set a steady pace, not too fast, trying to conserve their energy. This was going to be a long day. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter. The men were still searching, but they were searching in the wrong direction. For now. Thomas knew it wouldn't last. These people, whoever they were, had resources. They'd have radios, maps, maybe even drones. Eventually, they'd find the trail. Eventually, they'd figure out where Thomas and Emma were headed. But eventually wasn't now. They reached the fire tower just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. The structure stood 50 feet tall, a metal framework supporting a small enclosed cabin at the top. The stairs were coated with ice, and several of the lower steps had rusted through completely, but the tower itself looked stable enough. Thomas tested the first step carefully, putting his weight on it slowly. It held. "Stay close," he told Emma. "Watch where I step and do the same." They climbed carefully, Thomas leading the way and testing each step before trusting it with his full weight. The metal groaned and creaked under them, and twice Emma's boots slipped on the ice, but they made it to the top without incident. The cabin at the summit was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with windows on all 4 sides and a trapdoor in the floor that opened onto the stairs. Thomas pushed open the door and they stepped inside. The space was empty except for an old wooden chair, a metal desk bolted to the floor, and a cabinet that had long since been stripped of whatever supplies it once held. But it was dry and out of the wind, and from here they had a 360-degree view of the surrounding mountains. Thomas could see his cabin far below, the black SUVs still parked outside. He could see the ridge they'd just crossed, and he could see the forest spreading out in all directions, vast and white and unforgiving. Emma collapsed into the chair, breathing hard. Her lips had a bluish tint and she was shivering despite the layers of clothing. "We can't stay here long," Thomas said, pulling the backpack off his shoulders. "But we need to warm you up before we move again." He pulled out one of the emergency blankets, the kind that looked like aluminum foil but reflected body heat. He wrapped it around Emma's shoulders and gave her a water bottle and an energy bar. She ate mechanically, her eyes never leaving the windows. Thomas moved to the west-facing window and scanned the forest below. At first he saw nothing, just trees and snow and the occasional bird taking flight. Then he saw it, movement. 4 men, moving through the woods in a line, weapons ready, following the ridge exactly as Thomas and Emma had done. "We've got company," he said quietly. Emma stood and moved to his side, peering out. "How long until they get here?" Thomas did the math. 30 minutes, maybe 40 if they're being careful. "What do we do?" That was the question, wasn't it? They could run again, but they were already exhausted and Emma was showing signs of hypothermia. Another few hours in this cold and she wouldn't be able to walk, let alone climb. They could try to hide, but there was nowhere to hide up here. The tower was visible for miles in every direction, which left one option. "We make a stand," Thomas said. Emma looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You mean fight them?" "I mean make them think twice about coming up here." Thomas moved to the desk and pulled out the Glock, setting it on the surface. Then he unslung the rifle and checked the chamber. "I'm not going to shoot anyone if I can avoid it, but they need to believe I will. That's the only language people like this understand." He positioned himself at the north window, the one facing the direction the men were coming from. From here, he had a clear line of sight down the mountainside. He could see the trail, see the approach. Anyone climbing up would be exposed, vulnerable. "Emma," he said, "I need you to stay low and away from the windows. If shooting starts, you get down on the floor and you stay there. Understand?" She nodded and moved to the corner farthest from the windows, wrapping the emergency blanket tight around herself. Thomas waited. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature inside the cabin rose just enough to stop his breath from fogging. He could feel the sweat on his back despite the cold, could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd been in situations like this before, a long time ago in places he tried not to think about. He'd sworn he was done with violence, done with the part of himself that could look down a rifle sight and make impossible decisions. But that was before Emma, before a child had appeared in his life and reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. The men came into view exactly 32 minutes later. 4 of them, just as he'd counted, moving in tactical formation up the trail. They were maybe 200 yards out when one of them spotted the tower and signaled to the others. They stopped, regrouped, and Thomas could see them talking even though he couldn't hear the words. Then one of them pulled out a radio and spoke into it. Calling for backup, Thomas thought, or instructions. Either way, it wasn't good. The men started forward again, moving more cautiously now. When they were 100 yards from the base of the tower, Thomas made his decision. He opened the window, letting in a blast of freezing air, and aimed the rifle at the ground 10 feet in front of the lead man. He took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the mountain like thunder. Snow exploded where the bullet hit, and the 4 men dropped instantly, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Thomas worked the bolt, chambering another round, and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a voice called out, amplified somehow, maybe a megaphone. "Thomas Garrett, we know you're in there. We're federal agents. Send the girl down and no one gets hurt." Thomas didn't respond. He kept the rifle trained on the trees where the men were hiding. The voice came again. "We're authorized to use force if necessary. This is your last warning." Still, Thomas said nothing. Let them wonder. Let them worry. The longer they hesitated, the more time he had to think. One of the men broke cover, moving quickly to a boulder closer to the tower. Thomas tracked him with the rifle but didn't fire. Another warning shot would just waste ammunition. But the message was clear. Come closer and the next one won't miss. The man stopped behind the boulder and stayed there. Thomas could see the others shifting position, trying to find angles, trying to get a bead on the tower. They were good, he'd give them that. Well-trained and disciplined, but they were also exposed and they knew it. Anyone climbing that tower would be a sitting duck. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Thomas's arms started to ache from holding the rifle steady, but he didn't lower it. Behind him, he could hear Emma breathing, quick and shallow. She was terrified, and he didn't blame her. The radio on one of the men crackled, loud enough that Thomas could just barely make out the words. "Chopper inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Damn it. A helicopter changed everything. From the air, they'd have a clear shot at the tower. They could land men on the ridge, surround the structure, turn this standoff into a siege that Thomas couldn't possibly win. He needed to change the equation. "Emma," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the men below. "In the backpack, there's a cell phone. The old one from the bunker. Get it out." He heard her moving, heard the zipper of the backpack. A moment later, she pressed the phone into his hand. Thomas glanced at it quickly. The battery showed half charge. Enough. "There's a number in the contacts," he said. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Helena, call it." "What if she's one of them?" Emma whispered. "Then we're already dead," Thomas said bluntly. "But that note said she was clean. It's the only shot we have. Call her. Tell her where we are and what's happening. Tell her about the bunker and the files. Tell her everything." Emma took the phone with shaking hands and scrolled through the contacts. She found the number and pressed dial. Thomas heard the ringing, once, twice, 3 times. Then a woman's voice, tinny through the small speaker. "This is Chen." Emma's voice came out barely above a whisper. "My name is Emma Delaney. I'm the daughter of Michael and Patricia Delaney. They're dead. The people who killed them are trying to kill me too." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Emma, where are you?" "Montana, Copper Ridge. There's a fire tower. We're trapped. There are men with guns and they're going to kill us." "Who's we? Who are you with?" Thomas took the phone. "My name's Thomas Garrett. I found the girl during a storm. I also found a bunker full of files about a witness protection program that was compromised. Names, dates, evidence of corruption, everything. The people down there pretending to be federal agents are trying to make sure that evidence never sees daylight." A pause. Then Agent Chen's voice came back, harder now, focused. "The old sanctuary program. Jesus Christ, we thought all those records were destroyed. You're saying you have them?" "Every file, every tape, every photograph, hidden in a bunker under my property. But right now, that doesn't matter. Right now, I've got armed men trying to take this kid, and I've got about 10 minutes before a helicopter shows up and makes this situation a whole lot worse. Give me your exact location." Thomas rattled off the coordinates from memory. He'd mapped this entire region years ago, knew every peak and valley by heart. "I'm 3 hours away," Chen said, "but I can have Montana Highway Patrol there in 45 minutes. "We don't have 45 minutes. Then you need to hold them off. Whatever it takes. That girl is the last witness to a conspiracy that's killed dozens of people over 3 decades. If she dies, the people responsible walk free. Do you understand me?" Yeah, Thomas said. I understand. I'm on my way. Don't let them take her. The line went dead. Thomas handed the phone back to Emma and returned his attention to the men below. They'd spread out more, trying to flank the tower. The helicopter was getting closer. He could hear the faint whoomp-whoomp of rotors in the distance. What did she say? Emma asked. She said help is coming. We just have to last long enough to see it. One of the men made a move, sprinting from cover toward the base of the tower. Thomas didn't hesitate. He fired, the bullet hitting the ground inches from the man's feet. The man dove back behind cover, and Thomas could hear him cursing. Next one goes through your chest, Thomas shouted. I don't care what you're pretending to be. Stay back. For a moment, there was silence. Then the megaphone voice came again. But this time it wasn't offering negotiation. It was giving orders. Target the tower supports. Bring it down. Thomas's blood went cold. The tower was old, the metal weakened by decades of weather and rust. A few well-placed shots to the support beams and the whole structure could collapse, with him and Emma inside. Get down, he yelled to Emma, and dropped to the floor just as the gunfire started. Bullets slammed into the metal framework, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The tower shuddered and swayed, and Thomas felt the floor tilt beneath him. Emma screamed, wrapping her arms around the desk leg. Thomas crawled to her, covering her body with his own as the world exploded into noise and chaos. The shooting lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it stopped, Thomas's ears were ringing and the smell of gun smoke hung in the air. He looked up cautiously. The windows had shattered, glass covering the floor. Daylight showed through new holes in the walls where bullets had punched through, and beneath them the tower groaned like a living thing in pain. One of the support beams had been hit. Thomas could see it through the trapdoor, the metal twisted and bent, barely holding. The tower was still standing, but not for long. Another burst like that and it would come down. The helicopter was close now, maybe 2 minutes out. Thomas could see it cresting the eastern ridge, a black speck against the pale sky. When it arrived, this would be over. They'd land men on top of the tower, or just shoot through the walls until there was nothing left to shoot at. Thomas looked at Emma, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. He'd promised to protect her. He'd promised she was safe, and now he was about to break that promise because he'd underestimated how ruthless these people were. But he wasn't done yet. He grabbed the rifle and moved to the shattered north window, ignoring the glass cutting his hands. The men below were regrouping, getting ready for another assault. The helicopter was banking toward them, coming in fast. Thomas had maybe 30 seconds before this went from bad to impossible. He raised the rifle and fired, not at the men, but at the helicopter. The shot went wide, as he knew it would, but it sent a message. He worked the bolt and fired again, this time closer. The helicopter banked hard, the pilot not expecting resistance. "Come on," Thomas muttered, firing again. "Come on, you bastards, give me something." The helicopter pulled back, gaining altitude. The pilot wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to risk taking a round through the cockpit. But that only bought seconds, not minutes. They'd regroup, come at him from a different angle. And then, cutting through the chaos, Thomas heard something beautiful. Sirens. He risked a glance to the west and saw them, 3 Montana Highway Patrol vehicles racing up the access road, lights flashing. They weren't close, still a mile or more away, but they were coming. And the men below heard them too. Thomas saw them look at each other, saw the moment of decision on their faces. The voice on the megaphone barked one final command. Fall back now!" The 4 men retreated quickly, moving back down the trail the way they'd come. The helicopter hovered for a moment longer, as if considering making one last run at the tower, then banked away and followed the SUVs as they peeled out from in front of Thomas's cabin and disappeared down the mountain road. They were running, because whatever authority they were pretending to operate under, it didn't extend to killing a child in front of actual law enforcement. Thomas lowered the rifle, his hands shaking from adrenaline. The tower swayed beneath him, the damaged support beam groaning. It wouldn't hold much longer. "Emma," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to get down, right now." They moved carefully through the trapdoor and onto the stairs. Every step felt precarious, the entire structure shaking with their weight. The damaged beam was visible now, twisted metal barely clinging to its mountings. Thomas went first, testing each step, with Emma right behind him. They were halfway down when the beam gave out with a shriek of tearing metal. The top of the tower lurched violently to one side. Emma screamed and grabbed the railing. Thomas lunged back up the stairs and caught her arm, pulling her against him as the world tilted. For a moment they hung there, the tower swaying like a tree in a hurricane. Then, with agonizing slowness, the structure began to stabilize. "Go!" Thomas shouted. "Move!" They scrambled down the rest of the stairs, feet slipping on ice, hands gripping rusted metal. Thomas's lungs burned and his heart hammered, but he didn't stop. 10 feet from the ground he jumped, landing hard in the snow and immediately turning to catch Emma as she followed. They stumbled away from the tower just as another support beam failed and the entire top section crashed down, metal screaming as it folded in on itself. Thomas and Emma stood in the snow, gasping for breath, watching the tower collapse into a twisted wreck of metal and memory. And then the highway patrol vehicles were there, 3 officers jumping out with weapons drawn, shouting for them to put their hands up. Thomas raised his hands, the rifle hanging loose from one hand. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "We're the victims here. The shooters ran. They went east." One of the officers, a woman with sergeant stripes, approached cautiously. "You Thomas Garrett?" "Yeah. Agent Chen from the FBI called us. Said you were in trouble. Said you had a witness who needed protection." Thomas nodded toward Emma. "This is Emma Delaney. Her parents were murdered 6 days ago. The people who killed them just tried to kill her too." The sergeant looked at Emma, taking in her tear-stained face, her 2 big clothes, the terror in her eyes. Her expression softened. "Jesus Christ. Okay, come on. Let's get you both somewhere warm. Chen's on her way. She'll want to talk to you." They were led to one of the patrol vehicles, the heater blasting, blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Emma sat pressed against Thomas's side, shaking not from cold but from the aftermath of adrenaline. One of the officers radioed for medical support and an investigative team. Another started documenting the scene, taking photos of the collapsed tower, the bullet holes, the tracks in the snow. Thomas stared out the window at the mountains he'd called home for 11 years. The mountains he'd thought would keep him safe from the world. But the world had found him anyway, and now everything was about to change. Emma tugged on his sleeve. He looked down at her. "Did we do it?" she whispered. "Did we win?" Thomas thought about the men who'd gotten away, about the helicopter that had disappeared over the ridge, about all the people documented in those files who'd never see justice. But he also thought about Agent Chen racing toward them, about the evidence still hidden in the bunker, about Emma alive and safe beside him. "Yeah, kid," he said quietly. "We won." And for the first time in days, Emma smiled. Agent Sarah Chen arrived 3 hours later in a black sedan that looked out of place against the snow and patrol vehicles. She was younger than Thomas expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused energy that came from someone who'd spent years chasing ghosts. She wore a dark suit under a heavy coat, and when she stepped out of the car, her gaze immediately found Emma sitting in the patrol vehicle. Thomas watched as Chen approached, her credentials already out and displayed. She spoke briefly with the sergeant, showed her FBI badge, then turned toward the vehicle where Thomas and Emma waited. When she opened the door, Emma instinctively pressed closer to Thomas. "Emma Delaney," Chen said softly, kneeling in the snow so she was at eye level with the girl. "My name is Sarah Chen. I've been looking for you for 6 days. I'm so sorry about your parents. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect them." Emma's lower lip trembled. "You knew them?" "I knew about them. I've been investigating the Sanctuary program for 2 years, trying to figure out what went wrong. Your father tried to reach out to me 6 months ago, but someone intercepted his message. I didn't know until it was too late." "They killed them," Emma whispered. "They came in the middle of the night." Chen's jaw tightened. "I know, and I promise you, Emma, we're going to find everyone responsible, every single person. She looked up at Thomas. "And you must be the man who found her." "Thomas Garrett. Agent Chen told me on the phone you have evidence, a bunker full of files." Thomas nodded. "Under my property. I bought the land 11 years ago, never knew it was there until Emma showed up. The place is sealed, untouched. Everything's still inside." Chen stood, brushing snow from her knees. "I need to see it, now. Can you take me there?" 20 minutes later, Thomas was leading Chen and 2 Montana State investigators down the passage beneath his shed. Emma had stayed above with the patrol officers, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot chocolate someone had produced from a thermos. Thomas had wanted to stay with her, but Chen needed him to show her the bunker, and Emma had nodded that it was okay. The metal door swung open, and Chen stepped inside. For a long moment, she just stood there, taking it all in. The filing cabinets, the desk, the wall of photographs and red string. Her hand came up to her mouth. "My God," she breathed, "it's all here. Everything we've been looking for." She moved to the nearest filing cabinet and pulled open a drawer, her fingers dancing over the folders. She pulled one out at random, flipped it open, and her eyes went wide. "This is the Martinez family. They went missing in 1994. We never found them. The official report said they violated protocol and disappeared on their own." She looked up at Thomas. "They were murdered, weren't they?" "According to the files, yeah, along with about 30 other families." Chen's face went pale. She moved to the wall of photographs and stared at the faces marked with red X's. Her finger traced over one photo, then another. "These were all people we were supposed to protect, people who trusted us." Her voice cracked. "And someone sold them out." One of the state investigators spoke up. "How deep does this go?" Chen turned to face them. "Deep enough that people were willing to kill a 7-year-old to keep it buried. We're talking about federal agents, possibly judges, maybe even someone in the program's administration. This is going to blow up when it goes public." "Can you keep it from going public?" Thomas asked. "At least until you've secured the evidence and protected anyone who might still be at risk." Chen looked at him with something like respect. "That's exactly what we're going to do. This bunker is now a federal crime scene. Nothing leaves here without proper documentation and chain of custody. We're going to catalog every file, every tape, every piece of evidence. And then we're going to use it to burn down everyone involved in this." She pulled out her phone and made a call. Within an hour, a team of FBI agents and forensic specialists had descended on Thomas's property. They photographed everything, bagged and tagged evidence, set up a command center in Thomas's cabin. The small, quiet space that had been his sanctuary for 11 years was suddenly filled with federal agents, state police, and the organized chaos of a major investigation. Thomas stood outside, watching it all unfold, feeling like a stranger in his own life. Emma sat on a log nearby, still wrapped in blankets, watching the activity with wide eyes. "Everything's going to change, isn't it?" she said quietly. Thomas sat down beside her. "Yeah, I think it is. Are they going to take me away? Put me somewhere?" "Probably into protective custody, at least until the trial. Chen seems like she knows what she's doing. She'll keep you safe." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to go." "I know, kid, but you can't stay here. It's not safe." "It was safe with you." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. That was luck. Next time we might not be so lucky. "Will I see you again?" He wanted to lie, to tell her yes, of course, everything would be fine. But Thomas had spent too many years being honest with himself to start lying now. "I don't know. Probably not for a while. You'll be in protective custody. New name, new identity. That's how these things work." "It's not fair," Emma said, her voice small. "I finally found someone who cared, and now I have to leave." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "Listen to me. What happened to your parents, what almost happened to you, it's not over. There are people out there who need to be held accountable. Chen's going to do that, but she needs your help. She needs you to be brave a little while longer. Can you do that?" Emma nodded against his shoulder. Will you be okay after I'm gone? The question surprised him. In all the chaos of the last few days, he hadn't thought about what came after. What his life would look like once Emma was gone and the FBI cleared out and he was alone again on his mountain. The isolation he'd chosen, the silence he'd craved, suddenly felt less like safety and more like emptiness. Yeah, he said finally. I'll be okay. But he wasn't sure he believed it. Agent Chen emerged from the cabin and walked over to them. Emma, we need to get you somewhere secure. I've arranged for a safe house in Helena. It's comfortable, well protected. You'll have everything you need. Emma's hand tightened on Thomas's arm. Can he come? Chen looked at Thomas, then back at Emma. Mr. Garrett has his own life here, and we need him to stay and help us process the crime scene, answer questions. Please, Emma whispered, just for a few days, until I feel safe. Chen studied them both, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she nodded. 3 days. Mr. Garrett, if you're willing, you can accompany Emma to Helena and stay at the safe house until she's settled. After that, we'll need you back here. Thomas met Emma's eyes and saw the hope there, fragile and desperate. He thought about saying no, about maintaining the boundaries he'd built around his life. But looking at this child who'd survived impossible odds, who trusted him when she had no reason to trust anyone, he found he couldn't do it. Okay, he said. 3 days. The safe house was a 2-story colonial on a quiet street in Helena, the kind of house that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Inside, it was anything but. Reinforced doors, security cameras, panic rooms, and 2 armed agents who rotated shifts in the basement. Chen had set them up in adjacent bedrooms on the 2nd floor, both comfortable but sparse. That first night, Thomas sat in the living room while Emma slept upstairs. He couldn't sleep himself, his mind too full of everything that had happened. Chen joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. You did good up there, she said, handing him one. Most people would have panicked, maybe gotten themselves killed. You kept your head. I had practice, Thomas said. Long time ago. Military? Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, got out in 2006. Chen nodded slowly. That explains the tactical thinking. The way you fortified the tower, used the terrain. You have training most people don't. Training I hoped I'd never use again. But you did. For her. Chen gestured upward to where Emma slept. That says something about you. Thomas didn't respond. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window at the quiet street. Can I ask you something? Chen said. When you found her in the snow, when you realized who she was and what she was running from, why didn't you turn her in? Call the local police, hand her over to the system. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Because I know what the system does to people. I've seen it. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the people in charge are the ones you need protection from. He looked at Chen. And because she reminded me of someone. Who? My daughter, Sarah. She'd be about Emma's age now if she'd lived. Chen's expression softened. I'm sorry. What happened? Thomas set down his coffee cup. Car accident, 7 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light. My wife and daughter were in the car. Both died instantly. His voice was flat, emotionless, the way it always got when he talked about this. I was deployed at the time. Got the call while I was in Kandahar. By the time I made it home, they were already buried. After that, I couldn't be around people anymore. Couldn't be part of the world that had taken them from me. So I came here, built a cabin, tried to disappear. And then Emma showed up. Thomas agreed. And I couldn't walk away, couldn't let her die, because if I did, it would be like losing Sarah all over again. Chen reached over and squeezed his hand. You gave Emma a second chance at life. That matters. More than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the night. Finally, Chen spoke again. The evidence in that bunker, it's exactly what we needed. We've already identified 12 federal employees who were involved in the conspiracy. 4 judges, 3 marshals, 2 FBI agents, and 3 administrative staff. Some of them have already been arrested. Others are being brought in for questioning. What about the people who came after us on the mountain? We're working on identifying them. The helicopter registration was traced to a shell company with ties to organized crime. The SUVs were rentals, paid for with cash. We'll find them eventually, but it's going to take time. And in the meantime, Emma's at risk. Emma will be protected. New identity, new location, complete separation from her old life. She'll be safe. Thomas looked up toward the second floor. She's 7 years old. She shouldn't have to start over with nothing. No, she shouldn't, Chen agreed. But it's the only way to keep her alive. The next 2 days passed in a strange sort of limbo. Emma slowly began to relax, helped by the safe house's comfortable furnishings and the presence of a child psychologist Chen had brought in. Thomas spent his days being debriefed by various federal agents, going over every detail of what had happened, every file he'd seen in the bunker, every word the men on the mountain had spoken. At night, he and Emma ate dinner together, the two of them sitting at the safe house kitchen table while armed guards stood watch outside. They didn't talk about what had happened or what would happen next. They talked about small things. Emma told him about her favorite books, about the cat she'd had before they'd gone into witness protection, about wanting to be a veterinarian when she grew up. Thomas told her about building his cabin, about the wildlife he'd seen on the mountain, about his daughter Sarah and the time she'd convinced him to build a treehouse that took them an entire summer to finish. It felt normal, almost like family, and that terrified Thomas more than any of the violence they'd survived. On the third night, Chen knocked on Thomas's bedroom door after Emma had gone to sleep. "Can we talk?" They went downstairs to the living room. Chen sat across from him, her expression serious. "Tomorrow we're moving Emma to her permanent safe location. New identity, new school, new everything. There's a couple in Oregon who've been vetted and cleared. They've agreed to take her in as a foster placement." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's good. She needs stability." "Thomas, there's something else. The couple who'll be taking Emma, they're good people, but they're not you. Emma's been asking if there's any way you could be part of her placement, not as a parent necessarily, but as a guardian figure, someone she could maintain contact with." Thomas looked away. "That's not possible. I live on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. I'm not equipped to be part of a child's life." "You already were part of her life. You saved it." "That's different. That was survival. What you're talking about is years, decades. I can't do that." "Can't or won't?" Thomas stood and moved to the window. "I came to those mountains to get away from people, from connection, from the risk of losing someone again. Emma showing up, that was an accident. It wasn't supposed to happen." "But it did happen," Chen said quietly. "And now you have a choice. You can go back to your mountain and your isolation. Or you can be part of something bigger. Be part of her life. Help her heal." "I'm not qualified to help anyone heal. I'm barely holding myself together." Chen stood and walked over to him. "Thomas, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen a lot of survivors, a lot of people who've been through trauma. Most of them shut down, close themselves off. They survive, but they don't really live. Emma's different. Even after everything she's been through, she still has hope, still believes people can be good. You know why?" Thomas didn't answer. "Because you showed her. You proved it. When she needed someone most, you were there. Not because you had to be, but because you chose to be. That kind of example, that's what saves people. Not just physically, but in here." She tapped her chest. "Don't walk away from that." Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out at the dark street. Finally, he said, "What would it even look like? Me being part of her life? Regular visits, phone calls, being someone she can count on. The foster family is supportive of it. They understand Emma needs continuity, needs someone who was there at the beginning of her new life." Chen paused. "It wouldn't be traditional, but nothing about this situation is traditional." Thomas thought about his cabin, about the silence he'd cultivated for 11 years, about the walls he'd built around himself to keep the pain out, And then he thought about Emma's face when she'd asked if she'd see him again, about the way she'd smiled when he'd told her about Sarah's treehouse, about how she'd fallen asleep on his shoulder in the patrol car. 3 visits a month, he heard himself say, phone calls twice a week. I'll help however I can, but I need to maintain my own life too, my own space. Chen smiled. I'll make it happen. The next morning, Thomas was up before dawn. He made breakfast, pancakes and eggs, the kind of meal his wife used to make on special occasions. When Emma came downstairs, she stopped in the doorway and stared. What's all this? Figured you could use a good send-off before your big move. They ate together, both of them avoiding the conversation they needed to have. Finally, as Thomas was clearing the plates, Emma spoke. Are you really leaving, going back to your mountain? Thomas sat back down. Eventually, yeah, that's my home. Oh. Emma's voice was very small. But I'm not leaving you. Not really. He pulled out a piece of paper where he'd written his phone number. You're going to Oregon to a good family who'll take care of you, but I'm going to call you twice a week, and I'm going to visit at least 3 times a month. That's a promise. Emma looked up at him, tears in her eyes. Really? Really? You're stuck with me now, kid, whether you like it or not. She launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Thomas held her, feeling something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for 7 years. It hurt, this feeling, but it was also the first thing that had felt real in longer than he could remember. Thank you, Emma whispered against his shoulder. Thank you for not leaving me. Thank you for reminding me what it means to care about someone, Thomas said quietly. 2 hours later, he stood on the front porch of the safe house and watched as Emma climbed into a black sedan with her new foster parents. She pressed her face against the window and waved, and Thomas waved back, his throat tight. Chen stood beside him. You did good, she said. I just showed up. She did the hard part. You both did. Chen handed him a business card. My direct number. If you need anything, or if Emma needs anything, you call me, day or night. Thomas pocketed the card. What happens now with the investigation? We keep building the case. We have enough evidence to prosecute at least 20 people directly involved in the conspiracy. But it's going to take time. Months, maybe years. Emma will have to testify eventually, when she's older and ready. Will she be safe? As safe as we can make her. The people we've arrested were the main threats, but we're still hunting the contractors, the hired guns who actually carried out the killings. Until we have them, there's always a risk. Thomas looked at the mountains in the distance, thinking about the bunker beneath his property, about all those files documenting decades of failure and betrayal. Those families in the files, the ones who were killed, do they have anyone left? Anyone who needs to know what happened? Some of them. We're in the process of notifying next of kin when we can find them. A lot of these cases are old, trails gone cold. But we're trying. Good. Thomas turned to face her. And the men who came after us on the mountain. When you catch them, I want to know. Chen studied him. Why? Because I need to know Emma's really safe. Need to know they can't come back. I'll keep you informed, Chen promised. Thomas went back to his mountain 2 days later. The FBI had finished processing the bunker and sealed it with federal locks. His cabin had been cleaned and returned to some semblance of order, though it would never feel quite the same. Too many people had been through it. Too much had happened within its walls. He stood in the doorway, looking at the space that had been his sanctuary. The fire was cold, the windows dark. It felt empty in a way it never had before, not physically empty, but spiritually, like the isolation that had once felt protective now just felt lonely. Thomas built a fire and sat in his chair, the same chair where he'd kept watch over Emma those first few nights. His phone sat on the table beside him, charged and ready. In 2 days, he'd make his first call to Emma, check on how she was settling in. In a week, he'd drive to Oregon for his first visit. His life had changed. Not in the dramatic, violent way it had changed 7 years ago when he'd lost his family. This change was quieter, subtler, but no less profound. He'd opened himself up to caring about someone again, to the risk and pain and possibility that came with connection. And there was no going back from that. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and quiet. Thomas watched it through the window, thinking about Emma in Oregon, about the bunker beneath his shed, full of evidence that would bring justice to families long forgotten, about the path forward that he couldn't yet see clearly. He thought about his daughter Sarah, about the treehouse they'd built, about her laugh that had sounded like bells. For 7 years he'd tried to forget, tried to numb himself to the memory of her. But now, holding Emma's memory alongside Sarah's, he realized something. Remembering didn't have to be torture. It could be honoring. It could be carrying forward the best parts of people who were gone, letting them shape who you became next. Thomas stood and walked to the shelf where he kept a few photos. He pulled out the one of Sarah, 5 years old, missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera. He'd kept it buried in a drawer for years, unable to look at it. Now he set it on the mantel, right where he could see it. "I met someone you would have liked," he said softly to the photograph. "A brave kid. Reminds me of you." The fire crackled. The snow fell. And Thomas Garrett, who had spent 11 years hiding from the world, began to figure out how to live in it again. 3 weeks later, Thomas made his 3rd visit to Emma in Oregon. Her foster parents, David and Linda Reese, were good people, patient and kind. Emma was adjusting, though she still had nightmares and moments where the fear came back. But she was also laughing again, going to school, making friends. She ran to Thomas when he arrived, and they spent the afternoon at a local park, just talking. She told him about her new school, about a friend named Mia, who shared her obsession with horses. He told her about seeing a mountain lion near his cabin, about the first snow of the season. "I'm glad you came back," Emma said as they sat on the swings, moving gently back and forth. "I told you I would." "I know, but I wasn't sure I believed it. People say things and then they leave." Thomas stopped his swing and looked at her. "Emma, I'm not going anywhere. This is a promise. You're part of my life now, and I don't break promises to people I care about." Emma smiled, the first real unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "I care about you too." Agent Chen called that evening while Thomas was driving back to Montana. "We got them. The contractors who killed the Delaney's and came after you on the mountain. All 4 of them. They're in custody." Thomas pulled over to the side of the road. "You're sure?" "Positive. We matched their DNA to the crime scene at the Delaney house. We have recordings of them discussing the job. It's airtight. They're not getting out." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Emma can rest easier now. "So can you," Chen said. "Thomas, I meant what I said before. You did good. You saved her life. You gave her a future. That matters." After they hung up, Thomas sat in his truck watching the sun set over the mountains. He thought about the bunker full of evidence, about the trials that would come, about Emma growing up safe in Oregon with people who loved her. He thought about the life he'd built on his mountain, about the isolation he'd craved and how it had been shattered by one child's scream in a storm. He didn't regret it, not for a second. Anyone can choose to turn away when someone needs help. It's easier, safer, less complicated. But Thomas Garrett had learned that the hard way. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up. Stay. Fight for someone who can't fight for themselves. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas started his truck and headed home. Back to his mountain, back to his cabin, back to the life he was learning to live again. A life that was no longer about hiding from pain, but about honoring it, carrying it forward, and using it to become someone stronger. Because for Thomas and for Emma, the storm had passed. The secret door had been found. And what it revealed wasn't just evidence of crimes or conspiracy, but something more fundamental. It revealed that even in the darkest moments, even when the world feels cold and cruel and empty, there are still people who will stop in the snow. People who will build fires and share blankets and refuse to let the innocent die on their watch. The mountain man had protected a child. In doing so, he'd saved them both. the end. Up next, two more powerful stories of courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that form in our darkest hours. Click now to continue the journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that one person's choice to care can change everything.